It begins with the sound of 20,000 boots moving as one. It begins with the glint of morning sun on polished steel, with the distant thunder of Ottoman war drums echoing through the valley of Albulena. It begins with a commander who had spent 14 years running, hiding, striking like a ghost. And now, on this September morning in 1457, he would stand his ground. But the ground he chose was not open field. It was not a place of honor. It was a killing ground. 8,000 Albanian men, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers. The numbers alone tell you this should have been a massacre, but they don't tell you whose blood would water the earth. The year is 1457. For 14 long years, the Ottoman Empire, the most terrifying military machine the world has ever seen, has been trying to crush a rebellion in the mountains of Albania. And for 14 years, one man has made them bleed for every inch of soil. His name is Gjergj Kastrioti. The world knows him as Skanderbeg. The Ottomans know him as their worst nightmare. In the grand courts of Constantinople, now fallen, and in the palaces of Venice and Rome, they whispered his name with a mixture of awe and disbelief. How does a man hold back an empire? How does a force barely large enough to be called an army defeat legions that have conquered half the known world? The answer, on that September morning, would be written in fire and steel. But to understand what happened at Albulena, you must first understand what brought them there. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who took Constantinople with the blast of bronze cannons that shook the heavens, had a problem. While his armies marched across Europe, while his navies controlled the seas, while his shadow fell across kingdoms and principalities, these Albanian mountains remained defiant. They were a thorn in the empire's side, a small, sharp thorn that refused to be removed. Skanderbeg had been a hostage in the Ottoman court as a boy. He had served in their armies. He knew their tactics better than they knew themselves. And when he finally broke his chains and raised the double-headed eagle banner of Albania in 1443, he didn't just declare independence, he declared war on history itself. For 14 years he had used the mountains like a weapon. He struck, then vanished. He attacked supply lines, ambushed columns, and never, ever fought fair. Because when you're outnumbered 5-1, fairness is a luxury you cannot afford. By 1457, the Ottomans were done playing games. Sultan Mehmed II sent his most trusted commanders with an army that should have been overwhelming, 40,000 seasoned soldiers. This wasn't a raid, this wasn't a punitive expedition, this was an extermination. The Ottoman force was a testament to military perfection. At its core marched the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, boys taken from Christian families, raised from childhood to be warriors. They carried matchlock arquebuses, early firearms that spat fire and death. They had composite bows that could pierce mail at 200 yards, and at their belts hung the yatagan swords, curved blades designed for the close press of battle. These were not mere soldiers. They were instruments of imperial will. Supporting them were the Sipahi cavalry, heavy horsemen in chainmail and plated armor, their lances bearing the crescent banners of the Sultan. Light cavalry, the Akinci, scouted ahead. Their job was to find the enemy, harass, and report back. Behind them came the Azap infantry, irregular spearmen, and the Bulukbasi officers who commanded with iron discipline. They had artillery, bronze bombards that could shatter stone walls. They had numbers. They had resources. They had the weight of an empire behind them. And arrayed against them, 8,000 Albanian fighters, not professional soldiers in the Ottoman sense, but mountain men, shepherds who could track a goat across sheer cliffs, farmers whose hands were calloused from the plow, but could draw a bowstring with deadly precision. They wore not the standardized armor of empire, but padded leather, chainmail shirts passed down through generations, and helmets hammered out by local blacksmiths who knew each fighter by name. Their weapons were simple but brutal. The Albanian spate, a straight double-edged sword heavier than its Ottoman counterpart. designed to hack through limbs and armor with equal fury. They carried round shields of wood and hide, boiled and hardened, that could turn a spear thrust or a sword blow. Their spears were longer than a man was tall, used not in rigid formation but with the fluid grace of men who had hunted boar in dense forests since childhood. And they had something the Ottomans lacked. They were fighting for their homes. Every man among those 8,000 had a mother, a wife, children hidden in the mountain villages. They knew what happened when Ottoman armies took a town. They had seen the smoke. They had heard the screams. Skanderbeg's forces were organized into companies based on clan and region. The men of Dibra fought beside their cousins. The warriors of Mat knew the men of Kruj by sight. This was not an army of strangers. This was an army of brothers, and at their head rode Skanderbeg himself, his helmet bearing the goat crest that struck terror into Ottoman hearts, his sword named Pallid that had tasted the blood of would-be conquerors for 14 years. The Ottoman commanders, Isa Bey Evernos and his lieutenants, were confident. They had faced Skanderbeg before. They had learned, they thought, from past mistakes. They would not be lured into mountain passes. They would not split their forces. They would grind forward with overwhelming numbers and crush him against the anvil of their advance. They entered Albania in late summer, moving north from Macedonia, their columns stretching for miles. The Akinci raiders spread out, burning villages, seizing livestock, trying to force Skanderbeg into open battle. And for weeks, it seemed to work. Skanderbeg's forces fell back. They retreated before the Ottoman advance, never engaging, always just out of reach. The Ottoman commanders grew bolder. They believed he was finally broken, finally afraid. They believed he was running out of room to run. What they didn't know was that every step they took deeper into those mountains was a step Skanderbeg wanted them to take. The terrain around Albulena is unforgiving. Steep hills covered in scrub oak and pine rise abruptly from narrow valleys. Streams cut deep ravines. The ground is rocky, uneven, treacherous for horses and fatal for formation fighting. Skanderbeg knew every rock, every fold in the land. He had spent weeks positioning his forces, and he had sent his civilian population, women, children, the elderly, deep into the mountains to the west, where Ottoman cavalry could not follow. His plan was simple in concept, but required perfect execution. He would split his already small force into 3 parts. The first, commanded by his trusted Lieutenant Gjergj Kastrioti, would engage the Ottoman vanguard and then perform the most dangerous maneuver in warfare, a feigned retreat. They would have to convince 40,000 enemy soldiers that they were truly fleeing for their lives while maintaining enough discipline to not actually become a rout. The second force, led by Skanderbeg himself, would hide in the dense forests on the eastern slopes of the valley. They would be the anvil. The third and smallest force, perhaps 2,000 men, would circle far to the north, moving through goat paths invisible to Ottoman scouts, and position themselves behind the Ottoman column. They would be the hammer that fell from behind. On the morning of September 2nd, the Ottoman army broke camp and began its march northward through the valley of Albulena. The sun rose hot and clear, burning off the morning mist that clung to the hillsides. The Janissaries marched in tight formation, their officers calling the cadence. The Sipahi rode on the flanks, protecting the infantry column. The Akinci had reported no enemy contact for 3 days. The Ottoman commanders were relaxed, confident. Some rode at the front, sharing wine from a skin, laughing about how they would present Skanderbeg's head to the Sultan. Then the Albanians appeared. It started with a single horn blast, high and piercing, echoing off the valley walls. From the tree line ahead, Gjergj Kastrioti's cavalry emerged, not in a wild charge, but in a disciplined line, just enough to block the road. The Ottoman vanguard halted, commanders shouting orders. The Akinci rushed forward, but the Albanian cavalry held their ground, shields raised, lances ready. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the shifting of horses and the creak of leather. Then Gjergj raised his sword, and the Albanians attacked. They hit the Ottoman vanguard with a fury born of 14 years of occupation. Their lances struck home, piercing through mail and flesh. The Albanian swords rose and fell, hacking at the akinci and the forward janissaries. The Ottomans, surprised but disciplined, rallied quickly. Officers barked commands. The janissaries formed their firing lines. Match cords glowed. And then the Albanians did something unexpected. They broke. They turned their horses and fled, not in orderly retreat, but in apparent panic. Horses stumbled. Men dropped shields. It looked like a rout, pure and simple. The Ottoman vanguard, smelling blood, surged forward in pursuit. Commanders tried to hold them back, but the momentum was unstoppable. The entire column, 40,000 strong, began to move faster, to press forward, to chase what they believed was a crushed enemy. Isa Bey Evrenos, watching from his command position, saw what he thought was the final destruction of Skanderbeg's forces. He ordered his main body forward. The drums beat faster, the column constricted, men pressing together in the narrow valley, eager for the kill. What he saw was exactly what Skanderbeg wanted him to see. The Albanian fleeing cavalry rode straight into the mouth of the valley, a narrow defile where the hills pressed close. The Ottoman vanguard followed, then the main body, then the supply trains and rear guard. 40,000 men and horses packed into a space barely wide enough for 10 men to ride abreast. The walls of the valley rose steep on either side, covered in dense forest. And in that forest, 8,000 Albanian warriors waited. Skanderbeg himself was positioned on the eastern slope, lying flat on his stomach behind a fallen pine, watching the Ottoman column snake into his trap. He had forbidden any man to move, to speak, even to cough. The Ottomans had scouts on the slopes, but they saw nothing. The Albanians were invisible, part of the forest itself. Each man had covered his armor with branches and leaves. Their weapons were wrapped in cloth to prevent any glint of metal. They had waited since midnight, motionless, as the damp mountain cold seeped into their bones. Beside Skanderbeg lay an old man named John, a shepherd from the village of Kruje. He had 3 sons in the hidden force, and his hand gripped his spear so tightly his knuckles were white. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but that his wife would know he died facing the enemy, not running. Skanderbeg heard him and placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. The last Ottoman soldiers entered the valley. The rear guard was a mix of ASAP infantry and supply wagons. Their guards relaxed, laughing, already thinking about the evening's camp. They had no idea that behind them, 2,000 Albanian warriors had emerged from the goat paths and now blocked their retreat. The trap was closed. Skanderbeg rose to his feet. He didn't shout. He simply raised his sword, and the morning sun caught the blade. That was the signal. 8,000 Albanians stood up as one. The sound was indescribable. Not a battle cry at first, but the sudden rustle of 8,000 men rising from the forest floor. Then came the horns. Albanian war horns made from twisted goat horns blew a long mournful note that echoed down the valley. The Ottomans looked up. They saw the hillsides come alive with men, their faces painted with lime and charcoal to look like demons in the shadows, their eyes wild with the fury of a people who had nothing left but fury. The first arrows fell like a steel rain. Albanian archers, hidden in the trees, unleashed a volley that darkened the sky. These were not the powerful composite bows of the janissaries, but shorter hunting bows, easier to wield in forest terrain. The arrows were not standardized military issue. They were fletched by the archers themselves, tipped with steel heads hammered out in mountain forges. They fell among the packed Ottoman ranks with devastating effect. Men screamed as arrows found the gaps in their armor. Horses reared, throwing riders. The tight formation that gave the Ottomans their strength became their death sentence. There was nowhere to run. The janissaries, trained to perfection, tried to respond. They raised their shields and loaded their arquebuses. But the Albanians were above them, firing down. The matchlock guns, so devastating in open field battles, were nearly useless when your enemy was on a hillside 50 yards above you. The Janissaries fired anyway, the crack of gunfire echoing, but their balls whistled harmlessly into the forest or struck tree trunks. Reloading took precious minutes they didn't have. Then the Albanian infantry charged. They didn't come down in a single line. They came in a wave, flowing through the trees like water, each man picking his path, leaping from rock to rock with the sure-footedness of mountain goats. Their shields were small, round, designed for individual combat, not shield wall tactics. They used the terrain as a weapon, dropping from above onto the Ottoman column. The fighting was immediate and brutal. There was no gentle introduction to combat, no exchange of archery at distance. The Albanians fell upon the Ottomans with swords and axes and spears. The Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, trapped in the narrow valley, couldn't maneuver. Their horses, trained for the open steppe, panicked in the confined space. The riders were pulled from their saddles by Albanian spearmen who stabbed upward, the long spears punching through horse and rider alike. In the center of the valley, Isa Beyevrenos finally understood what was happening. He was no fool. He had fought in a dozen campaigns. He knew an ambush when he saw one. He began shouting orders, trying to get his men to form a defensive perimeter, but his commands were lost in the chaos. His messengers couldn't push through the packed mass of terrified soldiers. The Ottoman army, the most disciplined force in the world, was becoming a mob. Then the Albanian cavalry that had fled turned around. Gjergj Kastrioti's men had completed their performance. They had drawn the Ottomans deep into the valley, and now they wheeled their horses and charged back into the fray. But they didn't charge the front of the Ottoman column. That would have been suicide. They charged the sides, hitting the Ottoman flanks where the column was thinnest. Their lances, now couched properly for the charge instead of used in skirmish, drove deep into the mass of infantry. Horses trampled men underfoot. The Albanian riders stood in their stirrups, shouting the old battle cries of their clans, names that the Ottomans had tried to erase from history. The fighting devolved into thousands of individual duels, but the Albanians had the advantage. They had the high ground, they had surprise, and they had the desperation of men with nothing to lose. The Ottoman soldier, even the elite janissary, fought for pay, for promotion, for the Sultan. The Albanian fought because behind him was his wife, his child, his village. There is a difference between fighting for a cause and fighting for your blood. That difference was written in steel that day. But the Ottomans were not broken yet. Their numbers were still massive. If they could reorganize, if they could form a proper defensive square, they could still hold out. They might even turn the tide. Their commanders knew this. In the heart of the column, veteran officers began beating their men into order, forming a core of resistance. Skanderbeg saw this. He knew that an ambush, no matter how perfectly executed, could fail if the enemy found time to breathe. He needed to break their spine completely. He needed to kill their command structure. He gathered his personal guard, 200 of the fiercest warriors in Albania men who had been with him since the beginning. They were armed differently from the rest. Each carried not just a sword, but also a long-handled war axe, the kind that could split a helmet. And they had one other weapon. Each man carried between 3 and 5 javelins, heavy iron-tipped darts made for throwing from horseback. Skanderbeg led them not down the main slope, but along a goat path that switched back down the valley wall coming out behind the forming Ottoman defensive corps. They moved fast, half running, their armor clinking softly, their breath coming in controlled gasps from lungs conditioned by mountain living. They passed within yards of Ottoman soldiers, too busy trying to survive to notice the small group moving through the trees. They emerged from the forest like ghosts, directly behind the Ottoman command group. Isa Beyevrenos was surrounded by his senior officers and his personal guard, perhaps 50 men in total. They were sheltered behind a makeshift barricade of supply wagons, desperately trying to send runners with orders. The Bey was shouting into the face of a janissary captain, his spittle flying, when Skanderbeg's guard struck. 200 javelins flew as one. The heavy darts arced through the air, their iron heads spinning. They fell among the Ottoman command group with horrific effect. The javelins could pierce, mail, and even plate at close range. Officers fell, transfixed. Horses screamed and collapsed, their riders crushed. The precision of the volley was chilling. 200 darts, and suddenly the command group was decimated. Before the survivors could react, Skanderbeg's guard charged. They didn't come in a line. They came as a mob, each man picking a target, their war axes rising and falling with methodical brutality. Skanderbeg himself went straight for Isa Bey. The Ottoman commander saw him coming, recognized the goat-crested helmet, and raised his sword. The duel was brief. Isa Bey was a good soldier. Skanderbeg was a force of nature. Their swords met once, twice, the clash of steel, lost in the greater cacophony of battle. Then Skanderbeg's blade slipped past the Bey's guard and drove through his throat. The Ottoman commander fell, his blood soaking into the Albanian soil he had come to conquer. With the death of their commander, the Ottoman army broke. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where every man threw down his weapon. But the cohesion, the iron discipline that made the Ottoman war machine unstoppable, snapped like a rotten rope. The Janissaries, seeing their officers dead, began to edge backward. The Sipahi, their horses dead or panicked, abandoned their mounts and tried to flee on foot. The Azap infantry, the least trained, simply ran, and the Albanians let them run. Skanderbeg had given explicit orders before the battle. No pursuit beyond the valley mouth. He knew his men, in the heat of victory, would want to chase the Ottomans to the ends of the earth. But he also knew that a cornered enemy fights hardest. Let them flee. Let them spread panic through the rest of the empire. Let them tell their comrades what happens when you chase Albanians into the mountains. The fighting petered out as the surviving Ottomans streamed northward, leaving behind a valley carpeted with the dead and dying. The Albanian warriors, exhausted, bloodied, many wounded, stood among the carnage and simply breathed. The silence after battle is unlike any other silence. It's the absence of screaming, of metal on metal, of gunfire. It's a silence that rings in your ears. John, the old shepherd from Kruge, found 2 of his sons alive. The third had taken a Janissary bullet to the chest and lay dead on the hillside. John knelt beside him, closed his eyes, and wept. Not the loud wailing of public mourning, but silent tears that cut rivers through the dirt and blood on his face. Around him, other men were doing the same, finding brothers, cousins, friends. Victory has a price, and the Albanians paid it in their own blood. Skanderbeg walked among his men. His armor was dented, his sword notched. He stopped to help a young man bandage a wound in his leg, tying the cloth with hands that had done this 1,000 times. "Did we win?" the boy asked, barely 18 years old. Skanderbeg looked around at the valley of death, at the bodies of 40,000 men who had come to erase his people from history. And he answered, "We lived. Today, that is enough." But it was more than enough. When the counts were made, the scale of the victory became clear. The Ottoman army had suffered catastrophic losses. Contemporary accounts, corroborated by later research, put the number of Ottoman dead at 25 to 30,000. Not wounded, not captured, dead. Another 5,000 were taken prisoner. The Albanian losses, fewer than 1,000. A casualty ratio so absurd it seems impossible, but the mass graves dug that evening didn't lie. The weapons told their own story. Among the dead Ottomans you could trace the evolution of imperial warfare. Matchlock arquebuses, painstakingly reloaded and fired once before their owners were overrun. Composite bows, some still clutched in dead hands. Yatagan swords, curved and elegant, designed for a different kind of fighting than the brutal hacking of close ambush. The Albanian weapons were simpler, but effective. Straight swords with heavy blades, spears marked by the hands that had carved the shafts, round shields that had turned aside death. Mixed among them were captured Ottoman arms, turned against their former owners. But the true weapon had been the terrain. The Valley of Albulena had been a fortress more effective than any wall. It had funneled the massive Ottoman force into a killing zone, where numbers became a liability rather than an asset. It had negated the Ottoman advantage in cavalry and artillery. It had turned their discipline against them. When you can't maneuver, you can't adapt. The aftermath rippled across the Balkans. When Sultan Mehmed II received the news in Constantinople, he reportedly didn't speak for an hour. Then he threw his wine cup across the room and ordered the messenger out. The defeat at Albulena didn't just cost him an army, it cost him the momentum of his European conquest. For the next decade, the Ottomans would be forced to treat Albania not as a rebellious province, but as a hostile power that could not be conquered. In Rome, Pope Calixtus III received the news with joy. He had been Skanderbeg's primary supporter, sending funds and weapons. He called the victory a miracle, proof that the Ottoman tide could be turned. In Venice, the Signoria sent congratulations and another shipment of gunpowder. They had learned not to underestimate the Mountain King. But in the villages of Albania, they didn't celebrate with proclamations or feasts. They celebrated by planting their crops, by bringing their children down from the high mountain refuges, by sleeping in their own beds without fear for the first time in years. The victory at Albulena meant that for a little while longer, they could be Albanian. Not subjects of an empire, not slaves, just Albanian. Skanderbeg would fight for another 17 years after Albulena. He would win more battles, lose some, sign treaties and break them when the Ottomans violated the terms. He would become a legend in his own time, the man who held back the tide. But he would never again replicate the perfection of Albulena. You only get one ambush that complete in a lifetime. When he died in 1468, the Ottoman Empire finally overran Albania. But by then, the spirit of resistance had been forged in fire. The Albanian identity, which the Ottomans had tried to erase, had been hardened in the crucible of Albulena and battles like it. The double-headed eagle banner would fly again. The valley of Albulena remains today, peaceful, green, dotted with wildflowers in the spring. If you walk it, you might find pieces of rusted metal turned up by plows, fragments of swords, arrowheads, a broken piece of chainmail. The local farmers know the story, passed down through generations. They point to a hillside and say, "That's where Skanderbeg waited." They show you a narrow defile and say, "That's where they trapped them." The weapons are gone, rotted to dust. The armies have dissolved into memory, but the land remembers. The land never forgets when 8,000 stood against 40,000 and won. The Battle of Albulena teaches us many things about warfare, about leadership, about the power of terrain and the importance of knowing your enemy. But perhaps its most important lesson is this: an empire is a machine, efficient but brittle. A people fighting for their home is a living thing, flexible, desperate, and far more dangerous than any machine. The Ottomans brought an army to Albulena. Skanderbeg brought a nation, and the nation won. The numbers are staggering: 8,000, 40,000, a ratio of 1 to 5. In modern military terms, it should have been impossible. But Skanderbeg understood something that modern strategists sometimes forget. Numbers only matter if you can bring them to bear. The greatest army in the world, packed into a narrow valley and ambushed from above, is just a crowd of terrified men, and a small force of determined fighters, given the advantage of surprise and terrain, can become an avalanche. The weapons used that day reflected two different military philosophies. The Ottoman Empire was transitioning into the gunpowder age. Their janissaries carried matchlock arquebuses, weapons that required a complex reloading process. Pour powder, ram ball, prime the pan, light the match, aim, fire. In the chaos of the ambush, most got off one shot before being overrun. Their composite bows, the traditional weapon of Turkish archers, were more effective in the hands of veterans, but even these warriors could not shoot accurately while being charged from above. The Yatagan swords, curved and designed for slashing, proved less effective in the press of bodies than the straight, hacking blades of the Albanians. The Albanian weapons were older, simpler, but perfectly suited to the fighting style Skanderbeg demanded. Their swords were heavy, often single-handed but sometimes requiring two hands, designed for brutal chopping strokes that could sever limbs even through armor. Their spears, up to 9 feet long, allowed them to attack from above while staying out of sword reach. The round shields, often reinforced with metal bosses, were light enough to maneuver in forest combat, but strong enough to deflect arrows and spears. And those javelins, those heavy throwing darts, proved devastating when used en masse against a concentrated target like the Ottoman command group. The strategy itself was a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. The feigned retreat is one of the oldest tactics in military history, but it requires extraordinary discipline to pull off. Gjergj Kastrioti's men had to ride slowly enough to keep the Ottomans interested, but fast enough to not get caught. They had to look panicked while maintaining unit cohesion. They had to sacrifice some of their own, because in any retreat, real or fake, men die to save the rest. It was a performance, and they played their roles to perfection. The hidden forces required patience that seemed superhuman. Imagine lying motionless in a cold forest for 6 hours, knowing that at any moment, an Ottoman scout could stumble over you and reveal the entire plan. Imagine the discipline it took for 8,000 men to remain silent while 40,000 enemies marched below them, close enough to hear their conversations. But these were mountain men. They had hunted game this way since childhood. Waiting was in their blood. The final stroke, the assassination of the Ottoman command, was pure Skanderbeg. He understood that an army without its head is just a body waiting to die. The javelin volley was a tactic he had developed specifically for this battle, training his guard for weeks to throw in unison. The darts themselves were weighted differently from normal javelins, heavier in the head, designed to fall almost vertically from a short distance. They were meant for one purpose: to decapitate the enemy's leadership in a single moment of shock and awe. The aftermath of Albulena changed the strategic calculus of the entire region. For the Ottomans, it proved that Albania could not be taken by conventional means. They would spend the next decade trying to buy Skanderbeg, to assassinate him, to isolate him diplomatically. They would launch smaller, more cautious campaigns. They would never again send a major army into the Albanian highlands without years of preparation. For the Albanians, Albulena was proof that they could not only survive, but win. It attracted more recruits to Skanderbeg's banner. It convinced Venice to increase its support. It gave the papacy hope that the Ottoman tide could be turned back. But more importantly, it gave the Albanian people something they had almost lost: pride. The human stories from that day are mostly lost to history. We don't have detailed memoirs from the common soldiers, but we have fragments. A letter from a Venetian merchant who visited the battlefield 3 weeks later described the stench of death still hanging in the valley, the piles of Ottoman equipment being sorted and redistributed, the quiet dignity of the Albanian women who came to collect their dead. A papal dispatch mentions a captured janissary who told his interrogators that his unit had been told Skanderbeg's forces were broken, starving, ready to collapse. He said the moment the ambush was sprung, he knew they had been lied to. We know that after the battle, Skanderbeg walked among his men and spoke to as many as he could. He knew their names, their families, their villages. This was his true strength, not his tactics, but his connection to his people. An Ottoman commander saw his soldiers as units, as resources to be expended. Skanderbeg saw his men as neighbors, as kin. That difference mattered when the swords came out. The weapons and armor collected from the dead were redistributed. Ottoman mail shirts, superior to Albanian workmanship, were worn by Skanderbeg's guard. The captured arquebuses were studied, though the Albanians never developed a large firearms corps. They preferred the mobility of traditional weapons. The swords were re-hilted with Albanian grips. The shields were repaired. Nothing was wasted. These were a poor people fighting a rich empire. They could not afford to leave useful equipment on the field. The Valley of Albulena became a sacred place in Albanian memory. Songs were written about it, epic poems that were sung in taverns and around fires for generations. The story grew in the telling, as all great stories do. 8,000 became 6,000 in some versions, 10,000 in others. The Ottoman numbers swelled to 80,000, then 100,000. But the core truth remained: the few had beaten the many, and they had done it on their own terms. From a military perspective, Albulena is studied, even today, in war colleges. It is a perfect example of how terrain, surprise, and intimate knowledge of your enemy can overcome numerical inferiority. It demonstrates the importance of intelligence. Skanderbeg knew exactly where the Ottomans would march, because he controlled the information space. It shows the value of decentralized command. Once the ambush was sprung, each Albanian unit operated independently, adapting to local conditions without waiting for orders. The Ottomans, by contrast, were hobbled by their centralized command structure. When the head was cut off, the body died.